Hi, I'm Rasika, and I'll be talking about ethics and efficacy of unsolicited anti-trafficking SMS outreach. So in this paper, we're talking about the population of adult workers in the sex industry. So just some context before we jump in. Sex work is defined as the exchange of erotic labor or sexual services for money. And within this population, there is a spectrum of autonomy where there's people with a high degree of autonomy on one side and survivors of sex trafficking on the other. So we'll use sex industry workers to refer to workers all along this spectrum. It's important to note that survivors of sex trafficking are a relatively small fraction of this population. So the majority of the population see sex work as just a job. So this is our position statement. Basically, we advocate for ending the practice of arresting people for performing sex work. We want to decriminalize sex work. Basically, it follows the consensus in the sex industry for these reasons, and also just the consensus in some major organizations. In this paper, we talked to sex industry workers, and then we also talked to organizations that offer assistance to sex industry workers, assistance such as financial assistance, housing, legal, medical, immigration assistance. They offer these services with the goal of helping victims of sex trafficking. We're going to be talking about what we will call outreach platform. Basically, what it does is it scrapes the advertisements that sex industry workers write online to reach clients. It scrapes those and parses out the phone numbers and then puts them in this SMS outreach platform so that organization representatives can use the platform to send out text messages to those numbers. So we did 3 types of interviews. We interviewed employees and volunteers from what we will refer to as technology organization. And we also interviewed organization representatives that performed outreach. And of course, we interviewed sex industry workers, both those that had been reached out to and those who hadn't but wish they had been reached out to. So we found some tensions around unsolicited messaging. So we interviewed people in the sex industry all along the spectrum of autonomy. And everybody in that circle wanted some services, services such as, housing or legal support. But the ones who wanted to exit and wanted help exiting the sex industry was a much smaller subset. Organization representatives, they were contacting everybody who wrote an ad online, but their target contact was those who wanted to exit, because organization representatives, one of their main goals, in addition to providing basic support needs, their other goals was to convince contacts to exit the sex industry and to offer religion and prayers. So their target was this small subset. As you can see, there was some tension around proactive outreach on both sides. So sex industry workers, a lot of them felt that their privacy had been compromised. They think that this form of outreach may have been a bit of a waste of time in their opinion. So yeah, but then on the other hand, there were some sex industry workers that hadn't been contacted, but it would have been great if somebody had contacted them. And then organization representatives, also they were on both sides, because they found the people who reached out to them asking for assistance first, that it went a lot more smoothly. Whereas if the organization representative was the one performing outreach over and over, then a lot of them, they perhaps didn't want the outreach, but the organization representative had to decide if they wanted to keep pursuing that outreach recipient or not. In case it turns out to be that rare instance when somebody says, I was looking for someone, like, where were you? Why didn't you contact me earlier? So that was about whom they were reaching. There was also just some misalignment over the platform itself, because SMS text messaging is unreliable, because in the sex industry there are changing phone numbers, proxy texting services just for privacy, but also as a business practice. There were shared phones or lack of stable access to phones. Organization representatives were apprehensive about reaching a pimp, not language preferred by the community. Well, sex industry workers, none of them mentioned a pimp, but some of them did have assistants. And so, the person performing outreach would have reached the assistant. Those ads online, some of them had stated communication preferences. And so just mass messaging them would violate some of those communication preferences. Things like if they specify, don't text me, instead call me, or whatever method, or just follow these work hours. The platform kind of didn't take those into account. And then so the organization representatives that we talked to, they were aware of these preferences, but they didn't see why it might be important to prioritize following those methods. So those were just some tensions and misalignment. There were also some dangers of texting sex industry workers. For one, a lot of sex industry workers are not out. So, a message on their phone, something could out them to the people around them. That could be very dangerous. There's always the risk of law enforcement finding out. And then, of course, even if the person sending the outreach is not going to, put them in harm, somebody else might have access to those messages and then cause harm. A lot of these organizations had some themes of ideology and saviorship. And so even if they didn't, a lot of them did actually include scripture in their messages, but even if they didn't, they still advertised themselves as a ministry. Whereas sex industry workers, they preferred no religious organizations. Even those that had no preference still had no preference. Nobody preferred a religious organization to do the outreach to them. Finally, the organizations, one of their main goals was to help people exit the sex industry because they believed that people were not using their autonomy. They said, oh, it's never a choice. Whereas sex industry workers, all along the spectrum of autonomy, they preferred if the person doing outreach would acknowledge the autonomy that they had. They wanted to be empowered. They didn't want somebody to convince them to leave the sex industry. So after doing these 3 types of interviews, we came up with some community-driven best practices, and then we held some follow-up discussions to refine them and see how feasible they were. So before I discuss them, basically I wanted to say that unsolicited anti-trafficking outreach is harmful. So these best practices are for technologists who wish to do it anyways. The first best practice is to prioritize privacy when direct messaging sex industry workers. The second one is to use appropriate language, which is language that they use within the community themselves, and to avoid harassment with some basic, have a do not contact list and allow people to report harassment. And finally, since these organizations are providing services to all sex industry workers, then it would be great if their websites could reflect that by listing services and testimonials, including from non-trafficked workers, and make it clear that they will not assume that their clients are being trafficked. So, in conclusion, we found that technologists must always understand the population to avoid harming their target population. And so please feel free to contact us with any questions. Thank you so much.